Greetings to everyone. A warm welcome to the speakers, Mr. J. Gullish, Dr. Nandini Kannan, Mr. Dustin Bickel, Mr. Prabhu Bala, and our moderator, Ms. Varsha Radhakrishnan, and all the webinar attendees from different parts of the world. I am Rajashri Praveen, Research Associate with CPPR and the host for today's webinar on Transformational Technologies and US-India Science and Technology Cooperation. Center for Public Policy Research, CPPR, is an independent public policy think tank based out in Cochin in the Indian state of Kerala. Our engagement in public policy that began in 2004 has initiated open dialogue, policy changes, and institutional transformation in the areas of international relations and security, livelihood, education, urban reform, health, governance, and law. To know more about what we do here, please do visit our website www.cppr.in and our social media handles. This webinar is organized by CPPR in collaboration with the U.S. Consulate General in Chennai and the Indo-American Chamber of Commerce. Mr. Dustin Bickel, Economic Officer, U.S. Consulate General, will give the opening remarks in today's webinar, and Mr. Prabhu Bala, the Vice Chairman of the Indo-American Chamber of Commerce, Tamil Nadu. He is also the Director of Precision Equipments Chennai Private Limited. He will be providing the closing remarks. Today, we have with us a truly remarkable panel of speakers. It is with great pleasure that I'm introducing the panel. Our first speaker of the day, Mr. J. Gullish, is the Executive Director, Digital Policy at the US-India Business Council. He has passionately promoted digital development in more than 20 countries over his 25 years of experience in government, industry, and civil societies across telecoms, information technology, SATCOM, and cyber sectors. Most recently, he served as a digital policy officer at the US Embassy in New Delhi, covering cyber policy, telecommunications, information technology, digital inclusion, and commercial space. While at the embassy, he aligned US cyber policy toward India across multiple in-country US government agencies and consulates. He was also the in-country lead for the US-India ICT Working Group and the US-India Cyber Consultations. J. Gullish has previously worked in India's outsourcing industry and lived and worked in India for over 5 years. He has international technology experience in Southern Africa, Israel, and Vietnam. A very warm welcome to you. Our next speaker is Dr. Nandini Kannan, Executive Director, Indo-U.S. Science and Technology Forum. She has leadership experience in academia and government with an understanding of the critical role that science and technology play in this global interconnected society, and a deep commitment to education and workforce development. Since 2014, she has served as a program director at the US National Science Foundation, NSF, where her responsibilities included core disciplinary research, mathematical sciences research institutes, and workforce development programs in the Division of Mathematical Sciences, as well as a number of cross-directorate and cross-agency activities. She has served as a co-chair for several data science-related activities in support of harnessing the data revolution, one of NSF's 10 big ideas. Dr. Kannan has also helped to create partnerships with the National Institutes of Health to support collaborative efforts in biomedical data science. She is a fellow of the American Association for the Advancement of Science, American Statistical Association, and an elected member of the International Statistical Institute. It is a great pleasure, Dr. Nandini Kannan, to have you as our speaker today. Welcome to this session. Center for Public Policy Research, CPPR, in collaboration with the US Consulate General Chennai Public Affairs Section, is undertaking this project to study India-US relations, change, continuity, and transformation with a special focus on 4 areas of cooperation: US-India trade relations, US-India science and technology cooperation, Indo-Pacific strategy, US and India as partners in global climate initiatives. To that effect, CPPR has conducted a series of webinars, and today we are at the fourth webinar on transformational technologies in US India Science and Technology Cooperation, addressing the science and technology focus area. This topic is critical and transformative aspect for the US India relationship, and this has the potential to significantly accelerate the strategic and economic achievements of both the nations. To deliver the opening remarks for this webinar, we have with us today Mr. Dustin Bickel, Economic Officer, US Consulate General. Since Mr. Dustin Bickel is traveling, we will be playing his pre-recorded message for you all.
Good afternoon, everyone. I would first like to welcome all of the science and technology researchers, business leaders and entrepreneurs, members of the various chambers of commerce, and all of the aspiring students who have joined us today. I would also like to thank our esteemed panelists, Mr. Jay Gullish of the US-India Business Council, who I know quite well as we've been working together to support the US-India space relationship. In addition, we have Ms. Nandini Kannan, Executive Director at the Indo-U.S. Science and Technology Forum. And of course, today's moderator, Ms. Varsha Radhakrishnan, a research fellow at the Center for Public Policy Research. I want to offer a special thanks to CPPR for arranging what I hope to be a productive discussion. It is my pleasure to open today's webinar, the fourth in a series, focused on the theme of transformational technologies and US-India science and technology cooperation. Now, science and technology are critical components of the US-India comprehensive global strategic partnership. Our government research institutions, US and Indian private sector partners, and colleges and universities all work together to foster science and technology cooperation. Through all of this cooperation, we are strengthening our societies, growing our economies, and quite frankly, making the world a better place. Partnerships such as ours are built on a foundation of trust, and trust is rooted in spending time together, working together, and solving problems together. As an example, the United States and India have a long-standing relationship on technology-driven solutions to address climate change challenges. The Fulbright Column Climate Fellowship is an exchange program to strengthen scientific capacity in addressing climate change-related issues. And last year, the US-India Science and Technology Endowment Fund launched an Ignition grant program, which will support joint proposals to combat the climate crisis through championing new clean energy solutions. In addition, the U.S. Department of Energy, DOE, and its national laboratories are working on various initiatives under the Strategic Clean Energy Partnership, and the technical cooperation between India's Department of Atomic Energy and DOE continues to intensify. The United States Geological Survey and India's Ministry of Earth Sciences have a memorandum of understanding for the exchange of scientific resources, personnel, and technical knowledge in the areas of Earth observations and Earth sciences. At the heart of our space-related collaboration is the NASA-ISRO Synthetic Aperture Radar, or NISAR, which is a jointly developed Earth observation satellite project to measure Earth's changing ecosystems, dynamic surfaces, and ice masses, providing information about biomass, natural hazards, sea level rise, and groundwater, and will support a host of other applications. NISAR's data can help people worldwide better manage natural resources and hazards, as well as providing information for scientists to better understand the effects and pace of climate change. These are just some of the examples of our bilateral collaboration in the sphere of science and technology. It is vital that we work together to facilitate cross-fertilization among all of the available resources of our rich and dynamic societies, including private, institutional, and government partners to advance our collaboration. Now, there is much more that the United States and India can do together, whether it be in the fields of climate science, clean energy, health, biotechnology, or artificial technology. The challenges we face in the world are also opportunities for us to work together on solutions. I applaud India's innovation initiatives and want you to know that the United States has been and remains a strong and trusted partner for India through our joint US-India science and technology programs. Together, our scientists and engineers will continue to change the world. We live in exciting times where economic and social challenges can be overcome by human ingenuity. Finding ways to promote, sustain, and disseminate the benefits of innovation is a top priority for all our governments, as is the need to work with the private sector to ensure that appropriate incentives for innovation are created and respected. Now, we look forward to continuing our work with international partners to improve our innovation environments. The potential for mutual benefit through our cooperation is limitless. Well, I don't want to delay the panel discussion any further. I trust you will find it both informative and insightful. Thank you all.
Thank you. Sorry everyone for that slight technical glitch in the beginning. So now for today, the moderator is Ms. Varsha Radhakrishnan. Varsha currently leads analytics and growth initiatives for an e-commerce platform at IBM, where she leverages the power of choice architecture to drive positive user experience and growth in engagement, adoption, and retention. Prior to this, she was developing AI-informed solutions to address IBM's business challenges using predictive technologies, robotic process automation, and recommendation engines. Her academic focus areas are in economics and public policy. She is a research fellow with CPPR, handling technology policy and artificial intelligence. Welcome, Varsha, and over to you.
Thank you, Rajashri. Welcome to the speakers, Jay and Nandini, and all the webinar attendees. As two powerful democracies, India and the US have over the past several years also developed a really valuable partnership in an area that has the potential to significantly accelerate the strategic and economic achievements of both nations, while also helping to address some of the shared challenges. So in this webinar, I hope that we can demystify that partnership a bit, and also understand how actors at various levels, government to government, scientific bodies, companies, startups, initiatives, various permutations and combinations of those actually come together and interact in this setting. So keep in mind that this is a bilateral cooperation in science and technology, and is therefore not without its challenges as policy, governance, and resources struggle to keep up with that pace of digital acceleration. So as this cooperation moves forward, there are ways to reinvigorate that partnership to take the benefit of science and tech innovation even further. So the discussion today will be framed on 4 topics. The first is understanding the India-US science and tech partnership. Second, partnership enablers, barriers, gaps. Third, emerging technologies and skills. And the fourth is tech diplomacy. And so our speakers today come with their own unique and varied expertise. Nandini is a leader in the world of scientists and academia, and Jay is an industry expert. So I believe that their combined perspectives might help to develop a more comprehensive understanding of this space. With this, I'd like to turn it over to them to share their opening remarks. So let's begin with you, Jay. If you could spend the next 2 to 3 minutes addressing the following. Science and tech intersects several sectors such as defense, clean energy, banking. Which sectors have you been paying most attention to in the current Indo-U.S. partnership context? You are on mute.
Wonderful. First and foremost, I want to thank you for inviting me here. It's a real pleasure and honor to be part of these really critical and strategic conversations. As some of you have already mentioned, the United States and India are unique countries in their own right. They're both large democracies. They're in very different parts of the world. have very diverse societies, and they're technology powerhouses in their own right. There's another element as well, and the US-India relationship is really truly unique in the world. There's no two other countries, democracies or otherwise, that have a technology and a scientific sector that's so integrated. You could start with people, and I think the people-to-people movement is really critical. You could talk about technology, you can talk about organizations, you can talk about applications, products, or services, but at the end of the day, it's the people that count, whether they are the researchers, whether they are office workers, whether they are users of these ultimate science technology products and services. And so if you start there, the people-to-people relationship between the United States could not be stronger. It is a little bit lopsided, though. We should recognize that. There's a huge number of Indian students studying in the United States and has been for a long time. Many of those folks have chosen to stay and have developed a strong diaspora that are leaders in key science and technology areas, in medicine and IT in particular, but certainly throughout all sectors. We're starting to see in media and entertainment, for example, Indian Americans create their own cultural contexts and sharing that with the world, and that's valuable in its own right. And so when you look at the people-to-people movement, it's at scale, and it ultimately drives relationships, it drives investment flows, it drives a comfort level to operate, and it drives, a commonality in products and services at some point that, is this full science and technology ecosystem. On the American side, American companies have long been in India and really have recognized and utilized India's scale at technology capability. It's a unique relationship where if you look at something like semiconductors, about 20% of the world's semiconductor research is done in India, for example. Much of that, is done by American companies, and you could look at other areas of AI and IT, as well as medical devices and other industrial sectors. So that scale is really important. The other thing that I just want to mention up front is diversity. Both countries are very diverse. Not only are our governments decentralized somewhat, but we have cultural characteristics that differ from region to region. And India, obviously, is very diverse in terms of culture, language, and other sorts of things. And that diversity actually brings in a lot of, I think, value, different ideas, different ways of looking, but also ways to tap different types of markets. And when you combine the United States and India, two markets, two technology powerhouses, you add those together. And in fact, they're very much synergistic because they're different types of science and technologies and skills and other sorts of capabilities. And we're also two large markets, but also we approach how we purchase and utilize technology differently. And when all of this is combined, including the geography, and including some of the strategic rationales for us to working together in terms of democracy and looking around the world and how we want our combined future to look in the future, it's really, this conversation here and now could not be more important for our two countries because there's an opportunity here. We have a strong synergy, it's growing, but clearly around academia and basic and applied and commercializing science and other sorts of research is an area that we can do better. And so I want to thank you all for organizing this, and I'm really pleased to be part of this conversation and hope that we share a few nuggets of insight that some of us could take forward and it further improve the US-India relationship. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Jay, for your opening remarks. And Nandini, I'd like to ask you a similar question, maybe phrased a little differently. So from your experience, what have you seen are the most prominent ways in which the Indo-US partnership has served the scientific community that you're a part of?
Thank you so much, Varsha, and thank you for the invitation. As Jay said, I'm delighted and honored to be here. So I bring a slightly different perspective. So, talking about, students from India going to the US, I happen to be one of those many thousands of students who made that trip many, many years ago. And now I've come back. So it's full circle in many ways. And I've benefited from having studied and worked in the US and seen how the ecosystem works here in the US. And then I think I've brought some of those insights back to India in this position I have right now as part of the Indo-U.S. Science and Technology Forum. So one of the things that happens, with the large number of Indians, the diaspora in the U.S., many of us were in the science and engineering fields. As Jay talked about, the tech industry has, a large number of Indian Americans, and now you're seeing them in different fields. Jay talked about media, definitely medicine. So there's always been that people-to-people engagement because you come home, you bring that knowledge, the expertise, you mentor the next generation as well. So I think that's something that will continue. In terms of the people-to-people, I think when you talk about US-India strategic partnerships, I think over the last few years we've seen that partnership just increase in strength and strength. And science and technology has always been that critical piece of it. So even if other things didn't always happen, S&T cooperation has always been essential. So if you go back in time to when the Indian Institute of Technology in Kanpur was set up with the help of the top technical universities in the US, that collaboration's been happening. And so it's individual scientists, it's institutions that have really strengthened the S&T ties over the years. And I think we're seeing the benefits on both sides of that in terms of the large number of Indian students pursuing careers in STEM here and in the US. It's driving economic prosperity. It's bringing those technologies back to India. We have companies in the US coming here, investing in research and education. And it's full circle in many ways. So I see science and technology as sort of central to the strategic partnership, whether it's in core fundamental sciences, all the way from mathematics to applications. We are the two largest democracies that's been addressed. We also are responsible democracies, so we need to make sure innovation in science and technology, especially now with AI being the buzzword, we as two democracies need to be sure that we're looking at responsible innovation that's impactful for our societies that are so diverse. And so I think what we bring to the two countries as well as to the global community is that sort of view on science and technology as being a driver for responsible, impactful innovation. So I'm not sure I got your question, but I wanted to pitch this when I started. So thank you.
No, thank you so much for sharing that. I think both of you brought some really interesting points on the actual aspects of that partnership. Because what does a partnership really mean? And I think Nandini, I heard you kind of repeatedly speak about this idea of a full circle kind of a partnership. And Jay, I heard you mention some of that cultural aspect as well. So thank you both so much for those opening remarks. Let's start this discussion now with a conversation about the current US-India science and tech partnership and how we got here, kind of like a recap of that history. And of course, scientific cooperation goes all the way back to the 50s and 60s, perhaps even earlier with NASA, ISRO satellite communications experiment in 1975, which made information television available to rural India. And then we also have more recent bilateral initiatives, such as the India-U.S. Science and Tech Forum, of which you are a part, Nandini, established in the 2000s, which has facilitated thousands of interactions between Indian U.S. scientists. So my first question would be to you, Nandini. What would you say have been key moments in the history of the Indo-U.S. cooperation? And how have these moments shaped science and tech development for both countries?
So I may take your question and sort of answer it differently. I think there are some key moments in the history of science and technology cooperation, but I think some of it also happened, holistically. And there's always been science and technology cooperation even before the 70s and 60s, when you had students from India going to the US to study. So I think that's happened organically. I think there have been, with IIT Kanpur starting off with the collaboration with US institutions, it brought some of the institutional level collaborations, it cemented those relationships. So I think that was one sort of pivotal point. We talk about the collaboration in space. I think that was another pivotal sort of turning point for the collaboration, because you went from, engineering and some of the basic sciences to looking at, technology in a whole different way. More recently, I would say in sort of AI, innovation from machine learning, big data, with a lot of the big tech companies setting up research labs in India, I think that's been had a huge impact on India, and as well as the US. It's had an impact, but it's really pushed the IT industry to think very differently about how they have to situate themselves in the world. So I think it's had an impact on the educational systems. It's had an impact on how industries think about science and technology. And it's also pushed research in a different direction. So I think while there's been sort of the constant thread, there are these little peaks where collaborations or sort of big umbrella agreements between the US and India, the tech agreement, the setting up of this joint commission meetings, which are these big government to government, the ICTs. I think all of that sort of just helped to shine the spotlight very brightly on S&T. But I think there's been that constant, if you look at time series, there's always been that trend. And then you have these peaks where science and technology becomes, the spotlight. And I think this is another time with AI where we're seeing that spotlight shine bright and fierce on S&T.
That's fascinating. And I think you mentioned something that I think oftentimes, being in the policy world, we forget to think about, which is, you have these mechanisms and these rules and policies that come in place, but oftentimes they create a kind of behavioral and a perspective-based shift. And so when you were talking about tech companies coming and setting up research labs, and you were talking about how people start to think a little differently and approach that differently. So I think that's also a big aspect of the partnership. Jay, I'd like to give you a chance to answer that same question. What do you think have been, from your industry perspective, what do you think have been key moments in that partnership?
Thank you. There's really two that jump out at me, and they come from very different sectors. I mean, the first is something called the Green Revolution. It's also sometimes called the Second Green Revolution. There was a gentleman by the name of Norman Borlaug who really drove a lot of innovation, new science, and genetic understanding in agricultural technologies. There was an Indian scientist who was very much critical to Borlaug's work. His name was M.S. Swaminathan, and is very much recognized as one of the leaders of the Green Revolution. And so that really changed a lot in plants, how varietals were used, how irrigation worked, and a whole variety of other issues around soil content and weather and so on, including diseases. And that really changed the world in many ways. I mean, it sounds crazy, but in the 1960s, I wasn't quite alive yet, but people were talking about widespread famine. How were we going to feed 3 billion people? Now we're up to, I've lost count of how many billions of people, and yet the Green Revolution continues to change, continues to generate an immense quantity of food to feed our planet. And so I think that is one that just historically will be recognized as a truly critical US India scientific collaboration that really saved lives and changed the world in a lot of ways that we just can't even conceptualize now. The second one from that really is sticks out in my mind is in the year 2000, and talks about digitization and software, and in many ways was the seed that allowed the growth of India's widespread digital economy now. Today, we look back and we say, how is India a true powerhouse in software? There's about 1,000 companies that have global research centers in India. There's obviously hundreds of thousands of people that work at those centers, and they're developing software solutions and products in just a truly diverse array of sectors. A lot of the origin of that capability was in something called the Y2K dilemma or problem. For those of us that are older to remember, early computers only had 2 digits for years. We know we have 4 digits in years. And 20, 30 years later, around Y2K, there was widespread concern that when we went from 99 to 0, that the computers would go haywire and they would crash. And so for about a decade prior, companies around the world underwent a very manual process to review billions of codes, billions of lines of code to identify problems in that coding. And probably millions of young Indians sifted through those code lines. And in that, they learned about software, they learned about coding, they learned about American business culture, which is really critical. And then after the Y2K, those resources converted to slowly but surely what we see today. India having technology capability and software and engineering design at scale that's unparalleled around the world. India has the English language, which is the language of computers, but they also have the cultural connection and the business ties that enabled India's IT industry to flourish after that Y2K problem. So those are 2 very different examples, but both kind of jump out at me. And if I had to pick a third, it would be when the United States and India went to Mars together. We actually had joint missions to Mars. The United States had some of the infrastructure and communications and navigation. India had the platform around Mars. And there was a period of time where we both had orbiters around the red planet. And for those of you who know space science, that's a major historical point in time. And going to Mars has always been difficult, and it leads to failure much more than success. And yet the United States and India had 2 separate missions that were combining and working together to really explore the universe. So those would be 3 very different examples that jump out at me as pivotal, but also emblematic of what the potential for the 2 countries are.
Yeah, thank you so much for sharing that, Jay. I think like those, I definitely see those as like milestone moments, like large structural shifts in the way we started working together. And I know you've also had, you've also led the India ICT, US India ICT working group. So I'd love for you to maybe just as a follow-up question, share a little bit more about, the role of that in facilitating partnerships too.
Absolutely. At the top of the hour, we talked about the diversity of our science and technology and innovation communities. And I've talked about this publicly, so it's not a surprise. The US and India have not only an opportunity, but there's actually almost an obligation to work together to try to set the foundational stones for the digital economy and technology going forward. Dr. Kannan mentioned, about ethics and responsibility. And I think we have this really unique position as 2 democracies in very different parts of the world, not only geographically, but socioeconomically. And that's why something like the US-India ICT Working Group is so critical. I have called, and USIBC has shared publicly, the need to elevate the conversation. The ICT Working Group, as important as it is now, is not at the level and doesn't represent the of the relationship to be truly effective. First and foremost, our governments at a bureaucratic level are not aligned. India has 3 separate digital ministries: IT, telecoms, and information and broadcasting. The United States has 0 digital ministries. And so unless you elevate the conversation, we end up in stovepipes, where the United States, the technology policy is driven by a set of agencies that doesn't necessarily align with similar agencies in India. And so when you have the line ministry of IT leading in India and the State Department in the United States leading, there's a misalignment unless you can elevate the conversation. And so we've been calling for an elevation of the conversation. There are international models out there, whether it's the Trade and Technology Council that the United States has with the European Union, you have Quad emerging technologies. But we need to get the conversation higher, and it needs to be broader based. And I say that because it's a gap, it's also an opportunity. And it's something that's been raised publicly and privately with both governments. And I think that there's a recognition on both sides at the government level that higher level conversation would be effective. Those conversations also include a commercial dialogue. So industry on both sides comes together and joins the government. Thinking out loud here, there may be a opportunity to include other sideline conversations around academia or science and technology as well that could pull together universities and research organizations on both sides in the same way that industry comes together, represented through trade associations.
Wonderful. And I think actually some of the misalignment that you spoke about leads us very nicely into the second topic, which is about partnership enablers, barriers, and gaps. So, in any bilateral partnership, there are factors that enable or impede the outcomes of that partnership. We can think about resources, funding, investments, policies, perhaps even conflicting global interests. For instance, India's tech pool of tech talent moving to the US has, among other things, helped create some of the top AI startups in the US. And US tech executives continue investing billions in the Indian market. So while the US-India partnership has created some successful outcomes, it's of course not without its challenges. I mean, even thinking back to the 90s, conflicts over intellectual property rights almost brought science and tech collaboration to kind of a sort of standstill. So with this, we kind of begin the second part of the discussion. And so the first question would be to you, Nandini. What would you say are some of the enablers, and what are also some of the barriers to collaboration in the domains of entrepreneurship and startup ecosystems?
So we're switching gears here. So one of the things that the Indo-U.S. Science and Technology Forum does, and Dustin brought this up in his intro speech, we run the US-India Science and Technology Endowment Fund. So it's actually a collaboration between the two governments that funds startups, entrepreneurs, projects that are sort of rooted in science and technology and have to have a small business or an entrepreneurial entity on either side. So one of the things within the framework of the endowment, we funded over 10 years of grants. We give grant and aids to projects that are have a prototype, and we help them get to market. There has to be a synergy between the US and Indian side. So one of the barriers that often teams sort of talk about is the IP issue. And then how do you overcome that? Their IP is part of the science and technology agreement between the two countries, but it's often not clear how that applies to small businesses. So I think that's always a challenge. Another challenge that a lot of teams face is just finding the right partner on the other side. Academia is much more organized, and it's because you go to conferences, you meet people, the institutions, everybody's online, they've got a website. So it's much easier to find collaborators in the science and engineering space. Academic collaborations work beautifully, but it's much harder to get the innovators, the incubators on both sides. So one of the things that we've been talking about, and I would love to do, is some sort of enabling platform where people can sort of post ideas, and you can do some sort of a matchmaking. I think that's been one of the most difficult. It is very hard to do. India is putting in so much money into incubators at universities. There's the Atal Innovation Mission. There's a lot of buzz around entrepreneurship and innovation, even within the university community. So how do we create those partnerships, and how do we do it in a way that's sustainable? I mean, you can do it. We just put out a call for innovations for net zero, in the areas of renewable technologies, storage and carbon sequestration, but just finding teams on the other side who sort of qualify in terms of being a small business is much harder. So I think that would be one of the big barriers, the IP and partnership. How do you develop those agreements? When companies do it, they have an army of lawyers talking about this, but it's small businesses. They really don't have that kind of infrastructure. So how do we develop that infrastructure that can really help connect and then address some of these export-import issues that often come up when you're doing science and technology? You're working with something which may have a huge tax rate because it's used for purpose X, but you really want to use it for purpose Y, which will have a societal impact, but you end up falling under the same rules. So, these are the sorts of questions, above my pay grade, but it would be great when we're talking about, collaboration with chambers of commerce and other business groups. How do we provide platforms? How do we get information out to the communities? And how do we enable this? Because a lot of times, that it's too steep a hill to climb, and people just say, forget it. I don't need to go find a partner. So I would say that's been one of the biggest challenges and gaps.
Lovely. Thank you so much, Nandini. I do want to follow up on that. I know we recently had a discussion about small, medium enterprises and the innovation that occurs in that space. So there is obviously a really important opportunity in that area for collaboration. So what would you say are in that space, particularly small, medium enterprises in India and the US? What are some of the gaps in partnership in that area? And what do you think is needed to bridge that gap?
So I would say, the easiest thing to say is awareness, but it's also the most difficult because we need to get the message out. There are these sorts of opportunities. We need more funding, right? So I think the more funds we have available for joint innovative projects, especially in these clean energy, renewables, all under the Strategic Clean Energy Partnership. I think there are, DOE labs that fund, the SBIR program in the US funds small businesses. But again, the focus is, to make in America and employ US citizens. And I think you have the same thing here with, Make in India. So how do we bring the small business communities together to understand, there's opportunities. Sometimes it's a technology that's built for purpose A, but in India, you can make it at scale. You have manufacturing hubs. So how do you create awareness? And I think it's an easy thing to say, it's difficult to implement. How do you talk about, what makes a successful partnership? So I think those are the challenges we faced even within our small portfolio. It's people coming to us and saying, look, I have a great idea, but how do I find a partner? And we don't really provide that sort of platform. So platforms that connect, and then also, a how-to manual for navigating in India, or the same sort of manual for Indian small businesses looking for partners in the US. So, some sort of handbook. I'm sure it's available, but it's all in different places. So I always think there needs to be one spot where you go to and say, okay, trade, what are the regulatory hurdles that I need to, what do I need to do a clinical trial? So these are the sorts of things that are in different places. How do we bring them together to just connect these small businesses on both sides?
Thank you, Nandini. And Jay, I have a follow-up question for you based on some of these discussions and also something that you mentioned earlier about the misalignment and how when there is that misalignment, it's important to kind of elevate that conversation. So I kind of see that as maybe, if I've understood that correctly, as sort of a top-down understanding of how to resolve a conflict or something. So in your perspective, what are some of the top-down partnership challenges that India and US will need to overcome in making good progress in science and tech development?
Yeah, that's an easy question. So thank you for that one. At the very high, exquisite level, which often includes national security and critical technologies for defense, homeland security, and whatnot, it's really important that there is a strong political will to create that strategic relationship that would then allow, at the high end of advanced technology, interactions. That's starting to happen. India and the United States have a very strong political relationship. I think it's fair to say that current relationships or current circumstances are maybe providing a hiccup in that. But at the end of the day, the United States and India stand strong in favor of democracy, free choice, individual rights, those sorts of things that allow us to have a strong strategic relationship that would in turn allow us to collaborate on high-end technology research, often funded by our two militaries. There's some of that going on. There's a lot more capacity to do that. If you look at how the United States works with some of its other partners in NATO or the Five Eyes, there's clearly more interaction with other partners, but there's clear scope and opportunity to elevate the US-India relationship in that regard. That's ongoing. It's always going to be a work in progress, but going in a positive way. The second piece is on the commercial side, and at least out of the United States, a lot of our research and development resides in the commercial sector, and it's strong and growing. A lot of those research dollars actually go to India. So you might have a big American company who wants to invest in an AI or 5G or some new medical technology, and a lot of that research is already happening in India. What's also starting to change is that India Inc. is becoming significantly more engaged in the United States. And I've seen our Indian membership over the last 5 years really change the way that they focus on STEM education, skill development, research, and those sorts of activities in the United States. And that tells me that our relationship is maturing. It's not just one-sided. The next area is academic, and academic collaboration, I think, is actually one of the hardest things to do, because at the end of the day, it's driven by people, it's driven by collaborators that want to work together, it's driven by grant dollars that have to go to one funding agency or one foundation and so on. And that's where I think there's a lot of opportunity. Dr. Kannan mentioned, her program, but there's another Fulbright Nehru program that funds academics going both ways. And I think that's critical, because right now, at least in the academic phase, there is a little bit of a misalignment. US universities have an incredible amount of money. A lot of that is through endowments, which is not something that Indian academia largely has. Some schools have endowments that are larger than the GDPs of some countries, and that allows them to fund long-term research in ways that other sorts of grants or funding doesn't allow. So India doesn't have that very large pool of endowments. Flip that around, the United States lacks the actual human resources to do the research. And so we bring researchers from around the world to conduct that research. We actually enable that, and there's some movement in the current administration to further simplify or at least try to attract more talent in STEM and advanced technologies. So that academic piece is the one that I think is really hard, because it's a researcher at, I don't want to pick on any one university, but a researcher in Wisconsin doing, earth science part of a NOAA program. How do they get connected with a IMD center in India, because they're doing similar work? And that's really hard to do. And that's where conferences come in and things like that. But they need to meet, they need to have sort of a confluence of vision on their research. They need to identify that funding, and then they have to have mechanisms to maintain that collaboration over a long period of time, because basic and applied research have much longer research horizons than some of the commercial technologies. And so that's really hard to do. And in the United States, it's somewhat decentralized, the way university research works. There's also one additional thing that in the United States, and I don't think India really has it, we have something called the National Laboratories, which I want to say there's about 20 of them. Many of them are actually managed under government contracts, so they're private universities that are doing these national lab research. And India doesn't have that corresponding national labs. There are other sorts of centers. Israel has centers and NASA has centers, and we should encourage them to be doing science and technology together. But the national labs and the academia, they struggle. There's not a good connective glue to enable that. There's clearly a lot of joint research and collaboration. I should just be clear about that. But I'm talking about the potential and the scale of the two countries. So there's some going on. There's scope for a lot more, and the things that industry can do or even government can do are somewhat limited. And so a lot of it has to happen with students meeting at grad schools and then at conferences, and then deciding, that their research is collaborative and want to move forward. And that stuff is really hard to do. And I remember, I'm just going to share a personal story. When I was at the embassy, we organized
Jay, I'm so sorry to interrupt. Would you be able to wrap this up in the next 30 seconds? Move on to the next section. Yeah, wanted to definitely hear the story.
So we did something called the Indo-U.S. Science and Technology Summit. It was a massive event, and people asked me, is it a success? And I said, come back in 3 years. We'll decide if it's a success. And we came back in 3 years, and we found a couple of companies, and they were doing weather research together. And so it took 3 years from the conference to actually go back and say, to justify it and say, look, we actually stimulated some real collaboration here. So that's what makes it so hard.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for sharing that anecdote. So I think we're ready to move on to the third part of today's discussion on emerging technologies and workforce development. I think there are lots of examples that can be shared in this space. This is really kind of the crux of the conversation. So my first question is to you, Nandini, as both nations continue to become more AI-driven and dependent on digitization, how does the IT and data infrastructure need to evolve to support this effectively? And if we could take about 2 minutes to answer that, that would be great.
Okay. So I'm going to do what happens in a debate. So I'm going to respond to one of Jay's points. So in India, you have the CSIR system, which is very much similar to the US National Labs. The Council for Scientific and Industrial Research has a number of institutes all across the country focused on very specific things. So I think that infrastructure is there. And to your point about getting the academic community together, I think it's a lot easier to get the academic community together because there's professional societies. So I think what needs to happen is for everyone to come together to leverage resources. I mean, we're always talking about, constrained optimization problem. There's not infinite resources. So how do we leverage industry, academia, foundations, professional societies to have those events that are convening that help to seed and catalyze collaborations. And I think workshops and some of the activities that happen under my organization help. To the question at hand about AI and how as both nations continue to be more AI driven. So if you look at, I'll look at it from the research perspective first, right? So if you talk about deep learning, everybody's talking about deep learning and convolutional neural nets. If you look at the computing power needed to do one of those algorithms, it's massive. So in terms of the research community, I think the computing infrastructure needs to be scaled up. If you look at the US, some of the partnerships that have funded AI institutes are actually collaborations with federal funds and industry dollars. So, the big tech companies are putting in because they see value in providing the compute for these institutions, for the academic institutions. So that's going to be a huge driver of innovation in AI and research in sort of the foundations of AI. It's also a place where you're going to see more of a digital divide in India. It's there in the US as well. If you look at US academic institutions, we've faced this problem for a very long time, the haves and the have-nots. The type of infrastructure that's needed to go through an AI program, and you can't just teach the theory. Students have to learn to work with computers, sort of mine massive amounts of data. So some of it now can be done on a laptop, but if you're really talking about AI, then you will need huge amounts of GPU time. So that's one thing. The other thing where I see a huge need is actual data. AI is a monster when it comes to requiring massive amounts of data for things like predictions. If you're looking at machine learning, you require huge amounts of data for building the model, for validation. So access to data sets that are representative. I see that as one of the biggest challenges, and I brought this up in various settings in India. We need to be training our models on data that represents the Indian ecosystem. So running a machine learning algorithm on a data set that's got Caucasian data is not going to help in terms of predictive abilities, and you'll see the confidence, the error bars go up. So how do we build that data infrastructure? And when I mean data infrastructure, it's access to data sets, it's access to compute. How do we make sure that it's equitable as well? So we have more people. One of the things we've learned in AI is without multidisciplinary groups, without having diversity of opinions, diverse backgrounds coming together, you don't build good algorithms. So how do we make sure the technology, the infrastructure is available to more students across universities? And I'll talk about that in the Indian context. So I think those are going to be some of the huge barriers. Access to quality data. It's not just massive amounts of data. It's good quality data that can be used, data that's representative, data that's open source, so you can train and compare algorithms. And then, of course, the computing infrastructure, because that's what's going to help train that next generation of AI, the AI workforce that goes all the way across the data cycle.
Yeah, and on that topic of workforce, I actually had another question for you,
Sure.
Nandini, and if you could take a minute to answer this. So the proliferation of science and tech requires that there's also like that united effort to skill and then reskill the workforce. Mm-hmm. So you've done a lot of work in this space. What are your key learnings from your efforts, and what you think can kind of inform future initiatives in workforce development?
If I'm talking specifically about AI, one of the things that tends to happen, and this happened when big data was the buzzword, and then it became data science, and now it's AI and machine learning. It's all interdisciplinary. It's not a computer scientist sitting somewhere building a model, or a statistician, trying to develop a clustering algorithm. It's going to be driven by real problems. And for that, the folks on the technical side need to speak the language. So it is about coming together, having, you need the polyglots, you need people who can understand, the medical problem and learn how to develop the technology, the tools that will help solve the problem. So I think a lot of the training that happens in institutions needs to be much more interdisciplinary. It's a buzzword, it's used a lot, but it's very difficult to do. So how do you build programs that really help people to think about data, to understand where the data come from, all the way to the predictions and if they make sense? It's how to enable people in other disciplines, the social sciences, the biological sciences, who may not need to understand, neural networks, but really need to understand how to use algorithms effectively, to understand what it means for an algorithm to be fair or replicable, or the whole idea of explainable AI. So I think the training has to happen at several different levels, and we have to change our mindset about the silos. AI is going to require a workforce that moves between these disciplinary boundaries, just as we're talking about a global workforce that can move between geographic boundaries.
Okay, thank you for sharing that. So I think we're ready to move on to the fourth topic, but I think, so fourth topic being on tech diplomacy, I do want to tie in something from emerging technologies too, and this question is to you, Jay. How could a strong Indo-US partnership in tech and tech diplomacy serve both countries in the geopolitical landscape? And what kinds of technologies should be prioritized in the near future to serve this purpose? And if you could take 2 minutes to, I know that's a big question, but if you could take 2 minutes to answer.
Yeah, no, fair enough. So thank you. So I think there's 3 areas of technology that we should really perhaps prioritize over others. Not in any particular order, but you clearly have the strategic technologies that I've mentioned in defense and national security and things like that. Includes cybersecurity, I think is really critical. Where we've moved into this digital age, and early on the internet was not designed for security, it was designed for openness and sharing. And now in a more mature setting, we realize those vulnerabilities and weaknesses, they need to be corrected. They're not just technical, but as Dr. Kannan said, they're very interdisciplinary. It's things like fake news and propaganda and how all of that is used. And then also some of the cultural aspects online of cyberbullying. So that's all sort of in that strategic realm. Second is commercial. You have to have strong economies because that supports not only a strong defense, but also allows governments and people to thrive and prosper. So commercial technologies really need to be critical because it enables jobs and innovation and all of that. The third piece that I think the United States and India are uniquely positioned to work together on is things that sort of benefit humanity, medical sciences. We both have large populations that help AI understanding. We both have diverse cultures and genetic, backgrounds. And so I think if we could work in some of those areas of things like financial inclusion, health technologies, things that better, populations, and then those could be used internationally. Yes, they'll benefit Indians and Americans first and foremost, but they will also have other widespread implications. So those are the 3 areas that I would to look at. And of course, within any one, there's a large set of technologies, but I like to bucket it.
Excellent, thank you, Jay. And Nandini, you mentioned early on this idea of responsible democracies, which I think is a really critical part of tech diplomacy. So, as India and the US continue to shape this partnership, which factors of science and tech development do you think will be critical to protecting some of those democratic values, social good, and other US-India priorities? You mentioned a few things earlier, so I'd love to kind of crystallize those points. You are on mute, I think.
Okay.
So I'll talk about some of this in the context of AI, because I think it's easier to do, and then we can go to other areas of science and technology. So one of the biggest issues that is going to impact research and therefore innovation is data sharing. I think that is going to be one of the key issues the governments need to address, at least in terms of a bilateral. I know there's been a lot of talk about multilateral agreements around data and other things, but I think for research and innovation to happen in AI and some of these emerging technologies, we need to figure out a way to get some sort of agreement on data sharing, because that's what's going to drive the innovation that will lead to responsible use of AI and have this sort of equitable impact we're talking about. The other thing is, looking, more broadly at technology itself. How do we incentivize the research community to look at some of these big social good problems? For example, Google has a program on AI for social good, where it brings NGOs or folks with real challenges with the academic community. So how do we build those sorts of partnerships to get the research community to sort of think more strategically? But sometimes research is done in a vacuum. It shouldn't, but sometimes that's where we are. So how do we incentivize these interdisciplinary collaborations that have a real impact? And one of the things we need to recognize is the technology moves much faster than the regulatory and the sort of the policy frameworks that get developed. So I think it's important as two democracies for us to be nimble in the way we develop policies and frameworks. I think that'll be critical to ensuring adoption of AI with all the usual caveats of privacy and fairness and ethical use of data. So I think that balance between the need to protect and the need to innovate, I think that's a delicate balance, and it's something that's really important if we're going to push. And I think that's in all areas of science and in emerging technologies. I think that's going to be critical.
Thank you for sharing your thoughts, Nandini. We're ready to move on to the audience Q&A. We have some questions over here. The first question I'd like to direct to Jay, and it's by Purushendra Singh. What are the potential areas of collaboration between US and India in critical and emerging technologies? I know it might sound a little repetitive, but we didn't hear a lot of your thoughts, Jay, on the emerging technology section, so I wanted to give you a chance to answer that.
Yeah, so no, thank you for that. Right here and now, there's a lot of conversations about the need to enhance and continue the relationships that we have on things like advanced telecommunications, 5G, 6G, cybersecurity. We heard up front that there's a lot of exciting activities around space, particularly now in civil space, but that could be broadened to include national security space and also commercial space. The one area that I'm particularly taken with is quantum technologies. I think that is leaning, it's really advanced. It has a number of different applications that range from computing to cyber, to medical sciences, and to others. And I think it's going to be a foundational, basic understanding of that technology that will drive a whole series of innovations in a lot of different sectors. And I think that's an area that I'd like to see the two governments lean in. Again, that's not for the next 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 years. And of course, there will be some applications in quantum between now and in 5 years' time. But really long term, I think that's something that the two countries could be very well suited based on technology capabilities, strong scientific applications, markets that you can iterate product as well, and the diversity of technology and innovation to kind of look at the full breadth of where quantum technologies can lead us.
Excellent. This next question I'd like to direct to you, Nandini. It's by Joseph Martin. Can you please spotlight major areas where clean tech partnerships are emerging? Anything specifically on AI and climate risk, big data, GHG measurement, and DL and traceability of carbon credits? I don't know some of those acronyms towards the end, but perhaps the first half of that question is something that you could demystify for us.
Sure. So we're talking about the emerging areas or opportunities for collaboration. Is that sort of the broad?
Yeah, we're talking about clean tech partnerships specifically. Okay. And I think you probably facilitated some of that.
Right. So, we've had a partnership for clean energy between India and the US for several years now. So under that umbrella, the Department of Energy, the US DOE, and in India, the Department of Science and Technology have set up these joint centers that focused on solar. They've done biofuels. So there's been a long-standing partnership around clean energy. We've stood up a program on innovation. So looking at really taking research from the labs to market. So we're funding early stage innovations in clean renewable energy, energy storage technologies, again, US-India partnerships, and technologies around carbon sequestration. Of course, one of the things you're seeing a lot of now is the use of AI in sort of big climate science, so bringing data, satellite remote sensing data with mathematical physical models and data-driven models from AI to develop better predictions. So I think that's a huge area of collaboration, and it sort of feeds in nicely into some of the partnerships between the Ministry of Earth Sciences and the US Geological Survey and NOAA. So I think that's another area where we need everything from basic research all the way to taking that research to commercialization. So I see the entire cycle being critical. And of course, climate, everybody's talking climate now. So sustainability issues, the impact on biodiversity, I think that's going to be another place where there's a lot of potential for US-India collaboration.
Thank you, Nandini. This next question is by KV Thomas from Kochi, and it's for you, Jay. Thank you so much for your thoughts. How far has the commercialization and agency industry driven science and tech policies? And how do they impact the US-India cooperation in science and tech?
I mean, I think the question is really at that strategic level. The US-India relationship are strong, historically strong. And there are things that are going to come up that friends and allies have to handle and manage. And I think it's actually a testimony in these difficult times right now that you have two countries that have slightly different viewpoints on how to respond to what's going on in Europe, yet it's not going to undermine the long-term relationship and rationale of why we are partners. And that ability to have private conversations that all of us will never hear is important, because those conversations, I presume, are happening. It helps us look past where we are here and now to look at that long-term objective. And the long-term objective, I think, for two democracies is how do we really create a society, not only in our own countries, but everywhere, that imbibes some of those cultural things and those ethics that we really imbibe. And I think it's critical that we work together there. And so science and technology really will push us and pull us there as well. And so the current hiccups, I use that word, I'm not sure if it's the correct term. I don't think it's going to derail the relationship, because the fundamental alignment and rationale will remain going forward, regardless of who is in power in Delhi or in Washington. And it goes back to our core societies of just being multicultural democracies, strong people-to-people ties.
Thank you, Jay. This next question is for you, Nandini, and it's about endowments and entrepreneurial startups. How difficult has it been for endowments? And by the way, it's from Vaidehi S. How difficult has it been for endowments to do due diligence on fund managers during COVID times with restricted travel and limited in-person meetings?
Oh, that's a fairly technical question. Yes, I think for all of us who manage grants, the past 2 years have been difficult. Especially for the small business community, many of them had to close down shop. They didn't have access to staff. So I think what we've had to do in terms of due diligence is do a lot of video meetings. So Zoom is now the way we have people show us where they are in terms of their startup. So I think it's had a tremendous impact on technology, but it's also made people incredibly resourceful and innovative. So I think it's forced some of our grantees to think outside the box. So if they had to do something that required, X, they're making do with Y because it's taking, 6 months for something to come from the US. So I'll use the word jugaad, which in India I love. It's that how do you solve a problem and figure out how to do it with limited resources. And in COVID, I think we've seen that happen a lot. So yes, it's impacted the way we do our due diligence and project monitoring, but we've also had PIs really sort of be very creative in the way they've managed, and some of them will struggle because they need access to labs that have been closed, but others have continued to do some fantastic work.
May I add something there? I think, Dr. Kannan, you really touched upon something. I think it was Plato said, invention is the mother of necessity, or necessity is the mother of invention. It's the other way around. COVID really forced people to change the way they live, work, and play. And we adapted. We could have not had this conversation in the same way previous. We're all comfortable with the platforms. And no one wants to say we're glad it happened. It was a terrible time, but it really forced a lot of change. And much of that change is going to be irreversible and would not have occurred, period, without COVID. And certainly many things would not have occurred as quickly as they did.
Excellent. Thank you for sharing that. So we are at the end of the audience Q&A. I did want to take just a couple of minutes to wrap up and summarize what I heard from the discussion. And there was so much that I'm sure we all learned at the end of this. So I want to thank you both, Nandini and Jay, and the organizers of this session. I think one of the key things we spoke about was the uniqueness of the India-US partnership, and no other partnership being as integrated as this is in the science and tech space. Speaking to the whole idea that the whole is greater than the sum of the parts. And I think one thing that I heard recurrently throughout is the importance of how to organize people in this space, whether it's sort of at the ground up level, whether it's at the top down level and decision making, when we have misalignments, when do we come in and take a different approach. So I think the people is what counts. And even some of the conversations that the topics you brought up, Nandini, with collecting local data that is representative of people in that specific area, region, it does all boil down to some of those decisions. So, and even kind of in emerging tech, we spoke about quantum, cyber issues that matter to us today. So I think with all of these things, we're really positioned to, take the conversation forward and really ask ourselves, what matters now moving forward. And just because things have been set up earlier, how much do we rely on that? How much do we leverage that? But how are there also opportunities in the small, medium enterprise to create new partnerships and think in a different way about, enabling that through various platforms. So with that, I'd like to hand it over to Mr. Prabhu Bala, who I know has some closing remarks for us. So we'd love to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, thank you very much. This is Prabhu here from Indo-American Chamber of Commerce. And first off, I thank Center for Public Policy and Research, CPPR, the US Consulate in Chennai, and of course, Indo-American Chamber of Commerce for inviting me to give the closing remark. In fact, I was thinking it might be an easy task for me to summarize, but I believe, with a lot of intense, discussions starting from the 1960s until today and for the future, it's going to be a difficult task, but I'll do my best. Thanks to Rajshri for giving a beautiful introduction about the speakers, the moderator, and of course, a special thanks to Dustin from the US Consulate here in Chennai. He's been always very resourceful, and he did really set the context for the meeting. He's very resourceful for the chamber as well, and of course, thanks Jay from USIBC, and of course Nandini from Indo-U.S. Science and Technology Forum. They really shared some insightful topics. Of course, Jay did really well, starting from the 1960s and the Y2K problem, how we were able to solve, and then the recent, the Mars expedition. So it kind of gives you the entire history of the India-US relationships and where we are today. And of course, Nandini, she's the best example. She went to the US for her studies, worked there, did some research, and she's back and now trying to help the, both the countries to work together. That's really best example. And for sure, with the beautiful questions from Varsha, we also touched upon some of the gaps which Jay really highlighted on the endowment funds, which is being available in the US, not being available in India, and also the human resource, which is more available in India, and how we could collaborate with each other. That's definitely a wonderful piece of information. And also Nandini did comment about the SME industries, right? So SME industries, how in the US and India can work together. If we can have a program, even the chamber, Indo-American Chamber of Commerce can be a part of it. We can devise this together. And more importantly, both the SMEs from both the countries, they have to invest on time. That's something which is very important. Unless they don't invest on time, it's very difficult to discover each other. That was right. And then, of course, the key things which Jay summarized, security and defense and data, both are very important today. The commercial technology and more importantly, the technology for benefit of human living. Because, I don't know who coined this webinar, transformation technology. It's very perfect. And, unless we invest on those technologies, we will not have a better place to live. And of course, towards the end, we also talked about AI and how we need to have interdisciplinary cooperation between various science and technology forums. So all these really add up very well. And of course, the audience also had very good questions. So I feel that many more of these sessions should happen. And, Indo-American Chamber of Commerce is all ready to support these initiatives. And special thanks. We had 200 plus audience today. So special thanks to everybody for having spent time. And I wish, this is going to be a start of the journey, and we will have wonderful sessions like this in the future. And thanks, Varsha, to time everybody right, and then, keep everybody on toes. And I think it was a good session. I really enjoyed. I hope everyone enjoyed too. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Prabhu, for providing such a comprehensive and crisp conclusion to this remarkable session. Apparently, Mozart has once said that we live in this world to learn industriously and to enlighten each other by means of discussion, and to strive vigorously to promote the progress of science and fine arts. This session has truly nourished our intellect and piqued our curiosity. I express my heartfelt thanks to each and everyone who's made this possible, to the speakers, to the panelists, to USCG, to IACC, and each and every one of you joining us.